Are you good over there? We're good? You under the table, are we good? Somebody leaning under the table there, so we'll make sure we're ready to go? Okay, cool. Okay, folks, welcome. This is the last talk in this room tonight. It's been an amazing conference so far. Are we all having fun? A word of advice to those of you who are really impassioned about the talk you're seeing: it's best to wait to ask for questions and not charge up on the stage and get... that might not have been made clear from the start. We had an incident in the other tent where somebody called somebody an agent of Microsoft, which is the worst thing you could ever call anybody, and had a visit with the police or something. I don't know what's going on. It's hacker history. Something else which I think is really cool, which you guys should get involved with. We have our own GSM network now. What you do is just turn on your phone, scan for networks, look for a network called number 42, and you'll get a text message telling you how to register online, and then you can call people at the conference with their 5-digit extension at no cost. So that's pretty cool. Of course, you can't use your phone on your normal network when you do that, but who needs the outside world now? You know, we're all here. Okay, so this talk is Securing Networks from an ISP Perspective with Bradley Freeman. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to split the talk down into 4 sections. We're pretty unique as an ISP because we're a non-commercial ISP. So a bit about Janet and our network would be useful. Going to go through about Janet and Janet CSER and what we do. Some of the tools we have internally for detecting network abuse. And I'm going to go through some of the common incidents we have to deal with. Right, if you're not familiar with Janet, we're the UK's research and education network, which is really important to note. So we're non-profit. We don't operate our network to make money. And we're a public sector organisation, and the majority of the money that we get comes from the government, so we don't have to go charge subscriptions. So essentially, we're non-commercial, and that's the most important thing, and that will differentiate us totally from the talk you heard earlier by Scott, because although Access for All are a really good ISP, they do, at the end of the day, try to make money. We don't try and do that. Because we're in the UK, we're directed by, we're bound by UK law, and the biggest bits of UK law we're bound by are the Data Protection Act, which states who we can, and in most cases can't, share data with, which is a good thing, and the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, RIPA. This is when a variety of government organisations can come to us and say, I'd like to know the person who is using this IP address at this time. Sometimes they can ask us for the data from years and years ago. We don't actually have that data, because we try to keep as little data about our users as possible. So in those cases, we just pass them on to the end site. Also, because we don't try to make money, we've got a pretty security-favourable AUP. In it, it basically says if you've got a virus in your network, if you've got a significant amount of security problems, and you don't resolve it, we will black hole those IP addresses in the short term and eventually cut you off. Because we don't really care at the end of the day. We want a secure network. So we're based in 8 core points of presence up and down the UK, and we run 2 backbones. We run a 40 gigabit a second backbone and a 10 gigabit a second backbone. The 40 gig backbone runs the production IP traffic for nearly all of the sites in the UK, and the 10 gig is used for something called Janet Lightpath. This is where, let's say you had a load of telescopes in the UK and you wanted to collaborate that data in real time. That would require anything from between 1 and 10 gigabits of a dedicated point-to-point connection. That's all done on Janet Lightpath. So the 40 gigabit a second network is used purely for IP stuff, mainly going out to the internet. Got 5,500 kilometers of fiber. And to make life a bit easier and to keep the users happy, we split the UK up into 20 regional networks. So, for instance, Northern Ireland will be one and part of Wales. So they manage the last, potentially, couple of 100 miles to the user. In total, there's approximately 900 organisations connected. And because of our peering arrangements, we've got a little bit more than 180 gigabit a second worth of external connectivity. Point to note, we run IPv4 and IPv6 native, including multicast for IPv4 and multicast for IPv6 internally, but not IPv6 internet-enabled multicast yet, but we're working on that. So this graph shows the amount of traffic we have to deal with. Now, I'm not trying to say we're a massive ISP, because we're not, but we're a non-trivial ISP. We deal with a fair bit of data. Unfortunately, this graph ends at the end of last year, so it's carried on quite a bit, so you've got to imagine that. at the moment, we're probably dealing with we're receiving around about 7 petabytes worth of traffic a month, and we're sending around about 3 petabytes of traffic from our autonomous system to the internet. You'll notice we've got very, 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 very seasonal traffic. Because they're education and research users, they follow the school timetable. And we've got 3 terms in the UK. So the biggest dip is between the ends of the year, and it dips considerably in the main holiday season. So I was told to put in a slide in on who actually connects to Janet. Because FE, if you're not down with the lingo, is the majority of our connections. They're places which, they're sites where you'll go to do courses after your compulsory education, and they could be in anything from bricklaying to computing to sheep farming. HE, they're going to be universities, local authorities and schools. There's a low number of them because we'll often put in some big pipes into a local authority, and they'll handle the connections to all the local schools. Self-funded, they still fall within the remit of education and research, and dedicated research places. So in total, if you work it out, there's potentially 18 million plus potential users. Now I stress potentially, because we put big pipes into schools, an average FE site would get anywhere, well, they used to have a 10 meg connection, they're getting 100 megs now. The universities generally used to have 1 gig, they're being migrated up to 10 gigs. There's 18 million potential users, but we don't know exactly how many are using them on a particular day, because there might be 25,000, 50,000 people at a big university, and they're obviously not going to use it all on the same day. So some key figures about our network and what we have to deal with. Approximately 100 routers in the core, 300 regional area routers. We directly manage 400 end organization routers. There is a lot more connections, you'll notice, but a lot of the sites let us look after their router, something called the managed router service, because we don't want them to have flaky equipment on their end, and we recommend it if they haven't got the capabilities to run what I'd call a proper router. In total, around about 1,500 circuits make up Janet, and unfortunately, they're responsible for the majority of our outage time. You know, people either putting a building in the way of a bit of fiber or anything like that. So as mentioned, key points, 18 million plus users from 900 connected organizations, and they're nearly all education and research. Janet's a little bit older than 25 years old now, slightly older than me. And originally, we were only a research network, and the backbone was running at 9.6 kilobits a second. Today, as I speak, the network's running at 40 gigabit a second. And because we find that network traffic on our network is doubling roughly every 18 months, we're going to have a need for 100 gigabit a second sometime, you can work it out, sometime around about 2011. So we've already completed a pre-standards trial of 100 gigabit a second Ethernet over 103 kilometers worth of fiber. Because we're always chasing and we're always trying to get the fastest network speeds, what I find is the traditional, like, security in a box appliances where you can go to a mainstream vendor and you can buy a 1 gig or a 10 gig, you know, IPS, IDS, email scrubber, stuff that looks bad stuff on a network in a box. That's just not available at 40 gigabit a second yet. We could go out and hack together a solution which would look into it. But again, in a couple of years, we're looking to move to 100 gigabit a second. So that kind of technology isn't really for us. So about Janet CSERT, it's the team that I'm a member of. So I'm not going to go through this totally, but because you're all a reasonably technical audience. But CSERT, IRT, and CERT, they're all essentially the same thing. They all respond to security incidents on networks. Essentially, we coordinate within our community and with other certs and some other ISPs. And most of the time, we're providing advice and assistance in relation to security incidents with confidentiality. The confidentiality is a key point. A lot of sites, you know, if you were a reasonably big site or even a smaller site which didn't have the technical expertise to manage it yourself, if you did have a security incident, you're not exactly going to post it on a forum saying, guys, my web server's compromised, what do I do? So the confidentiality is a key point. It's having actually somebody they can turn to and trust. And we deal with incidents from all these institutions. So most of the time, we've already dealt with similar incidents. So what's the point in cooperating? Why do we cooperate? Well, as mentioned earlier, security threats are real. They happen all the time. They happen so often that they're a totally normal part of operations. They're nothing exceptional. We deal with hundreds of incidents a day. And unfortunately, or you might say fortunately, more and more parts of academia, like universities, they're having to act more like businesses because the government's making them do it, or they're trying to get some more money. So they're worried about things. So in particular, they're worried about DOS attacks. There's a certain time of the year in the UK when students start to apply for universities and try to get in. Let's say if a website was taken down and it was a university website at that particular time of year, that would really hammer their student intake. That would really affect them. And even more important is reputation. If, let's say, hypothetically, an oil company paid a prestigious university £1 million to do some research into carbon change or something, if that data was compromised, that data might be under a non-disclosure agreement. They could be directly penalized. But other institutions and other people who wanted to do research would have probably immediately discredited that institution. That would really, really harm their income. And I suppose, unfortunately, securing potentially 18 million users is not something we can do alone. And we find, by far, the most effective response to any computer security incident on our network is peer communications. So this is the official blurb from the website. You can all read. I'm not going to go through it all. But essentially, we take the lead on Janet's security policy. So we say what the best practices are, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing. We coordinate security responses. That's our main role, coordinating. And we also develop a couple of security resources. So because we're an ISP, we're not like a traditional enterprise. And I find a lot of security material out there is aimed kind of at enterprises. So we've got absolutely no control over an end system. No matter how virus-ridden or what was happening on an end system, I would be well outside of my remit to actually go up to that user and fix it or patch that machine. I can't do that. I have no control. I can't touch it. We also provide an unfiltered network. And when I say unfiltered, generally pretty much every IP on the internet, even stuff that is notoriously bad, we don't filter. We occasionally filter a couple of IPs, but they will be in a direct response to a security incident which we're dealing with. But they're not going to be long-term blocks. Generally, we'll work for a month or a couple of months, and we try and solve the problem. So ports such as 25, some ISPs block that, and ports you shouldn't even need on the WAN, such as 445 and 139, they're all open. Also, because it's not our data, and we didn't create the data, stuff like deep packet inspection, it's not practical at 40 gigs, as I mentioned. But because it's not our data, it might not even be legal. So because it's not our data and it's not our end systems, it's questionable whether we could even do things like scanning on a large scale. I'm not saying it is illegal in the UK. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm not saying it is or isn't legal, but it's not something we want to do because it has slightly grey area and we try to be the good guys. As I mentioned, security incidents are normal, and it all comes together because we work on the basis of operational trust. Incidents on Janet tend to follow a particular lifestyle. Hopefully, most of the time, we're giving out advice, telling them how to prevent and prepare, the usual stuff, the usual common sense kind of approaches. Hundreds of times a day, unfortunately, we identify threats in our network. So let's say we detected a hacker compromising a web server belonging to a university. So first of all, we need to analyze that data. We need to see the severity of the attack. We also need to see that if that attack is relevant at any other institutions. So we use the system I'll mention in a couple more minutes called NetFlow, and we'll see if that attacker has made similar collections on the same port. Then we can alert all the institutions. But very often it might not be somebody at a computer, but it's worms, and the worm will manipulate with multiple sites. So we very often alert sites as well when we come to clean up and assist. These smaller sites and some of the bigger sites either don't have the time or they don't have the technical expertise or the knowledge to go through the logs. So we help them on that, find out exactly what happened, and move back to the advice stage again. So this is the amount of incidents we deal with a month. In Scott's presentation earlier, he mentioned, I think he was dealing with about 125,000 incidents a month. These are all incidents we've actually raised communications with the customers. So this is stuff we've deemed serious enough to either send an email out or give a phone call. You'll notice, this year in 2009, we're expecting to deal with between 5,000 and 6,000 security incidents on Janet. And there's a couple of reasons for the sharp increase towards the end of the last year. Copyright notifications on Janet have been going up considerably. I'll come on to more of those in a second. And config has been a huge issue. Config has been a big issue, but because of work like the Shadow Server Foundation, we've had really, really great visibility into it. and we detected a lot of infected systems. So even though we're dealing with more incidents, I don't believe that Janet is a more dangerous place. In fact, I think this is a good thing. So if you break that down and look into the types of incidents we have to deal with on Janet, this is all stuff we've raised incidents about. As I mentioned, copyright's a reasonably big thing. The people who send out the copyright notices in the UK, they're nearly all against BitTorrent. And from what we can see, and what my understanding is, they connect to the tracker, but they don't actually connect to the swarm. And then they get a list of those IPs, and they send out notices to the ISPs like us. But that has a couple of downsides. I think the people who run the trackers might be aware of this and putting a couple of fake IPs. I've had incidents where they've accused a printer of downloading illegally, and they're accusing address space which isn't being routed. Yeah. Compromise is a really big thing. As I mentioned, we actually classify a compromise as a malware infection. So it's not something as, I suppose, exciting as somebody physically going and rooting a server. So that's the reason for a big portion of compromises. Compromises often, most of the time, lead to scanning. Config will scan on port 445, and config has been known to download WallDeck and send out a load of spam. So compromises often lead to scanning and unsolicited bulk email. The people who are really observant here and quite hot on their stuff might notice that all the stuff that is big on that pie chart is stuff we've got systems for detecting automatically and is reasonably easy to detect. Things like social engineering, they do happen a hell of a lot on Janet, but because we haven't got automated systems, a lot of it slips through the net. So we do detect that stuff, just not in the quantities because we've got automated systems for dealing with it. So dealing with 5,500 incidents, and we've got around about 7 full-time members of staff in the team, is not something we can do with something like Outlook. So we've got a tool called Request Tracker for Incident Response. I guess a lot of you are probably familiar with RT, which is developed by Best Practical. We originally developed this with a bunch of other CSerts, notably Red Iris. It saves us a hell of a lot of time, and I mean a lot of time with dealing with incidents. If you send me an email with an IP address, for instance, or a domain name, next to that will be a button, and I can click on that button. Straight away I can see any other similar incidents which are going on from the same IP, any other incidents from the same site, all the relevant contact details from our private Whois server. Saves us a lot of time. So we've got a couple of tools for detecting network abuse. So as I mentioned, off-the-shelf equipment running at 40 gigabit a second isn't really available. And we estimate that we'll be going to 100 gigabit a second sometime around about. We'll have a need for it in 2011. Main technical tool, I'll say, is NetFlow. A few of you are going to be familiar with NetFlow, but I'm sure a few of you aren't. NetFlow logs information of packets as it flows through it. So we get a picture of packets as they're moving across the whole of Janet, not on a specific point where an IDS or an IPS might be located. We try and log approximately 1 in 10 packets when we receive that information. We only log the layer 3 headers and some of the layer 4 headers. We only log things like whether it's TCP, UDP, some of the TCP flags. We don't get things like email addresses. We don't get things like HTTP headers. We are concerned about privacy. We automatically perform a heuristic analysis on that data and look for common threats. So simple stuff to detect would be like scanning. We might be able to detect brute forcing with it. The data is also only kept for a very, very limited period of time. We keep no backups and no archives of the main data. As soon as that's been deleted from our system after a really short amount of time, it's gone forever. You couldn't come to me and ask that data because it wouldn't exist anywhere. And we process around about 125,000 NetFlow records a second. So that's a fair bit of data. The system we've got at the moment is homebrew. You might see by the bottom, it's not the shiniest graph in the world from a commercial vendor. We're having a few growing pains with it because we're dealing with more and more data, and it doesn't do IPv6 very well. So we are trialing a couple of systems and looking to maybe upgrade it in the future. Interestingly, on this chart, I didn't actually mean to talk about it, but a couple of the ports we detected as scanning are actually botnet. Sorry, not botnets, they're BitTorrent. We don't actively target BitTorrent users because they could be doing something perfectly legal. That's a few false positives. We can also produce on-demand reports, and we produce the on-demand reports in relation to an investigation, and we keep that data for a bit longer, and we delete it after the investigation. We generally keep this data permanently if it is determined to be malicious or as long as it's needed for the investigation to be complete. So the top graph just shows the number of connections from a big university. They were dealing with around about 8,000 TCP connections that we detected every hour, and they can see a clear spike when they got hit by a spam attack. And this chart below just shows some of the tabular data we're able to get. So it's nothing that's really privacy concerning. Shadow server. Mentioned these before. These are, I can't stress enough how much shadow server has helped our network. It's really significantly helped us. If there's any shadow server volunteers here, I definitely owe you a beer, because I'm sure there's going to be a few of you. If you're not familiar with Configure and a couple of other, shadow server actively tracks and monitors botnets and botnet infections and botnet clients. Particularly with Configure. If you're not familiar with Configure, how Configure updates, each Configure infected bot will generate around about 50,000 domain names a day. It will then try and resolve those 50,000 domain names and connect to each one of those resolved IPs once. Shadow server have bought a couple of these domain names and pointed them to their honeypot, and depending upon the format of the HTTP request where they try to update on port 80, they're able to tell the variant. They can obviously find the IP. They then report that information to us. At one point, we were receiving around about 200 Configure reports every day. We actioned every single one of those Configure reports. Those are all infected machines, and at some point, we didn't know whether it was going to update to a banking Trojan or anything like that. So there was a real concern that this could develop into something worse. It obviously sending out a small amount of spam with Waldeck and scanning on 445. Nothing that's crazy mad, but it's still something we want to look at. As I said, every single one of those reports we dealt with. So they have significantly helped reduce the number of infected systems on Janet by a huge amount. We got a couple of darknets and honeypots, as you'd imagine, just the usual. We monitor malware and network scanning with them, so we see what the naughty people are up to. It provides a really, really basic form of early warning. So if we see an increase in the number of HTTP requests for a particular thing, so we saw an increase when there was a problem with PHPMyAdmin. I'll talk about that in a minute. That would indicate that bad people are trying to do bad things, and it gives us a guideline of what to look for. We also correlate some of the data with some of the other data we have. It's just a little chart, it's just to fill a bit of blank space, really. Just shows the number of top 5 darknet hits we had recently. See Configure probably on port 445, a few pings, and people probably scanning on port 22. As I mentioned, peer communication is the most scalable approach to network security we found. It's really top. So we got an internal mailing list called UKSec, where people in the Janet community can communicate one another. We've also got a closed announcement list where we send out announcements, and it goes to every single security contact we've got. But we don't like sending to it very often. There's no point in replicating data that's already on places like BugTrack or Full Disclosure, because people will just look at the emails and think, oh, not another bloody email from Janet CISA about some null vulnerability which does NAFL. So we only send out for reasonably critical vulnerabilities. The last one we sent out was for Bind 9, and it was a fair few months before we send out anything else. We also monitor a couple of external mailing lists for threats. So there'll be public ones like Full Disclosure and a couple of private ones which we might not meant to be on. We also receive a lot of reports from third parties. Unfortunately, not all abuse is visible at layer 3. It's not visible at layer 4. You know, things like death threats, you know, they might look like perfectly good things. The traditional email, nothing wrong with the email, but the contents of the email might affect somebody. So we receive all the time reports from third parties. The most common reports are automated, generally, and they're regarding copyright infringement from people trying to accuse printers of downloading files illegally, copyright infringement notices, some botnet clients from Shadow Server, and a fair bit of spam. As mentioned before, we also get a number of requests from Ripper for data, but because we don't have that data, most of the time law enforcement wants somebody to put handcuffs in, or they want a name they can track. Because we don't have that data, we can't really help them, so we pass them on to the end sites, and they have to deal with it themselves. Quite often they might not have sufficient logging, particularly the smaller sites, but that's their problem, not really ours. So I'm going to go through some recent common incidents we've had to deal with. These are traditional. We've had to deal with quite a few of these incidents. I haven't gone through anything exceptional, you know, anything crazy mad like somebody's private details were posted on this mailing list. I also haven't gone through anything which involved the police or Ripper. So it's like day-to-day work, really. And obviously, if I did mention a date, name, or time, it would be changed to protect confidentiality. Scott mentioned this earlier, and he's probably taken the wind out of my sails with this, really. DNS DDoS, the DNS amplification attack. A couple of months ago, we started receiving reports from another CERT team. I think it was another national CERT team. And they told us that approximately 160 servers on Janet were performing a distributed denial of service attack on one of their hosts. We looked into it a bit further, and it was all going on port 53, and it all seemed to be using the DNS infrastructure. Unfortunately, because DNS does use UDP, it's really simple. If your ISP doesn't support the correct filtering, that you can spoof the source IP, and that attack could be redirected, as you mentioned earlier. Now, I've got some fuzzy maths. I know this is fuzzy maths. Please don't mention the maths to me. It's to illustrate a point. I don't want people putting their hands up and saying, sorry, Brad, you've forgotten the layer 2 headers. You've forgotten that Ethernet has a minimum frame size. You haven't counted that in. And I know it's going to be around about a 32-byte packet. It might not be exactly a 32-byte packet. Anyway, so in the example here, all of the DNS servers in this attack weren't contacting authoritative name servers. They were just contacting any name server, which was either acting as an open resolver or sending out root hints. So in this attack, they'd send a single dot to a packet. So that single dot on some of the servers, depending upon their configuration, would send a list of the root hints. That root hint is a 500-byte file. So that packet originally going to the server was a 1-byte dot potentially, with an 8-byte UDP header, a 20 bytes of IP header, and 3 bytes of padding. So that's a 32-byte packet. That's going to hit the server. The server's going to look at it, and it's going to send a 528-byte packet in response. But that's going to go to the target of the distributed denial of service attack. So in my maths, that's about a 15.5 times increase. So thereby, I know this maths is fuzzy here, particularly with 8 megs out of an 8 meg ADSL line. Don't mention it, okay? But thereby, you can see an 8 meg ADSL line could potentially, if it was getting that, 124 megabytes on a target. So it was a big problem. We contacted all the sites, got them to change their config, but I don't think this problem is going to go away for a while because of the nature of DNS. And it's always going to be possible with DNS, well, for the the soon future, that this could be fixed. Clampy. Clampy's a really small Trojan that was on our network. It wasn't massive. We deal with new viruses and new Trojans all the time. And because of the nature of the job, we had to do a bit of research into them. So we got a sample. We had a little look at it. We had a look at some other information posted online. And we detected a command and control server in Chinese address space. Showed you your IP, showed you a date and time to come back, which was several hours later. It's not really a website that any humans would enjoy. So jumped to the conclusion, obviously, that was reasonable evidence that it was a command and control server. We used NetFlow straight away to detect the number of flows to that IP, spotted approximately 500 flows from 120 IPs. Each one of those IPs was a Clampy-infected system. So because there was an immediate threat to those systems, we black-holed the IP for around about a month, came back a month later, and we detected that there was only a couple of flows to the IP. So we did solve around about 120 virus infections on Janet from that. I'd like to think that we got rid of it, but more likely Clampy just evolved and is using new command and control servers. Compromised email accounts. Oh, these are the bane of my life. Really, these are. Friday lunchtime, I just finished a pasty, and I think it was a Mars milkshake. Enjoyed it a lot. Came back to the desk, and we were receiving multiple reports of phishing spam. Because the email account looked like a valid one at the site, we had reason to believe it was a compromised account and not somebody sending out spam. Generally, they make up random email addresses. The botnets we've seen which send out spam aren't that intelligent. So we contacted the site and didn't hear back from them for a while. And then we waited a little bit more. And then we chased them up with a phone call and said, deal with this now or we'll block you. Luckily, they got back to us and they changed the account password. And the attacks seemed to stop soon after that. They wanted a bit of help because they were a smaller site and didn't have the skills to kind of look at the data. And they sent over 16 megabytes worth of zipped up log files. Now, I didn't realize that zip compression was that good at text files. It turns out that was 200 megabytes of log files. So I didn't quite know what I was getting myself in for. That was a little bit too much for me to deal with in Vi or Notepad. So I used a tool called Splunk. I'm sure a fair few are familiar with Splunk. It collects logs from a load of servers and produces nice, pretty graphs when you can search for particular keywords. So I use that to look for connections which look suspicious to me. And this one caught my eye. Crazy Browser. If you're not familiar with Crazy Browser, I wasn't at that point. I haven't actually used it firsthand. From what I can see, it seems to be a version of Firefox which supports things like gestures, macros and mouse gestures. So the attacker actually logged in from Italian IP address space, immediately disconnected, and then connected via a proxy service somewhere in Germany using Crazy Browser. So I imagine they were copying, pasting with macros. So it wasn't an amazingly skilled attack. And then after a while, when you send out a load of spam from a valid email address, you get a load of responses. So we're talking things like out-of-office replies, emails from other servers saying, sorry, this user doesn't exist, what are you on about? So that mail account fills up really quickly. And depending upon the policies of that server, it might shut the mail account. So the person decided to connect to Exchange using an Exchange connector used by Windows Outlook from the same Italian IP. And around about the same time, we saw another connection from another Italian IP, which just logged in and logged out. So what I seem to think is, hypothetically, I don't know whether this is true or not, in this particular case, the attacker used his real IP address to log in initially, and then he was like, I can do something malicious. And then he went through the German proxy service, and then he wanted to use Exchange. I don't think Exchange uses port 80, so he might have just been proxying port 80, and he got one of his friends to do it. The site didn't want us to pursue this issue anymore, so we contacted the ISPs and the other cert teams. Undoubtedly, we didn't hear a response from the anonymous service because that's where they get their business from, really, dealing with bad people like that. But we wouldn't block that anonymous service because there might be legitimate users. I think that kind of differentiates us. We're very left-wing like that. We heard back from one of the Italian ISPs who told us it was dealt with, and one of the other ISPs didn't get back to us. I was quite surprised that one of them got back to us. It's very, very rare that ISPs actually get back to you on their abuse desks. There are some notable exceptions, such as XS for All, but a lot of ISPs don't. PHPMyAdmin. Now, this relates to a vulnerability which was patched in April, and some proof of concept code came out in June. We didn't have any issues with this until the proof of concept code came out. That we detected. So, straight away when this came out, we used Google, as we knew most of the naughty people would be using Google to find vulnerable systems. We contacted all those sites and tried to fix all the systems we could find in Google. Obviously, Google's not going to find everything. So some nice person, I think it was about a month later, called John Doe, I don't think that's his real name, posted a little message about an IRC server, which was being a command and control server for a little botnet. Straight away, that was brilliant for us. That was like, we can see every host on Janet, which is part of this botnet. That information is gold, command and control servers. I love finding command and control servers. It's brilliant. So we detected a number of systems, and from that, somebody sending a little email, trying to get people to join it, we were able to detect those systems and clean them up. In every single case in this one, the attacker, it was a script which would go scan, and then the script would find an infected system. It would upload something called C99 shell.php, C99 mad shell, if you're not familiar with it. From my understanding, I might be wrong, it seems to allow a remote shell on the system running as the user which PHPMyAdmin is running at. Most of the time, that's led to root compromises on these systems. They've obviously then joined them up using their botnet tool of choice to their own command and control server. So in summary, security incidents are absolutely normal. They're a normal part of our operations. 40 gigabits a second also requires a slightly different approach because we can't use a lot of the traditional tools. We can't use things like stateful firewalls. But by far, our best tool is peer communications. So in future, and this is where we'd like to go, we'd like to do some more analysis of some of our NetFlow data, and we'd like to produce some tools to our community. Because we have people on Janet who are, everything from people who just know how to run a Windows Server 2003 box to people who, like some of you, probably compile their own Linux kernels in their spare time for fun. We don't want to aim the people who are really hardcore into security because they're probably doing and creating their own tools themselves. So we want to reach out to the people, mainly in FE, who don't have a lot of those skills. We'd also like to enhance cooperation with the community, particularly if anyone here is actively tracking botnets or malware, stuff like command and control servers. In one command and control server, we can clean 100 machines on Janet. We'd love to share some of that data. We'd also like to work internally on creating some better tools internally for tracking malware. We're not that good when somebody sends us malware samples. We haven't got a lot of experience with it. So if there's any incidents with UK universities or any .ac.uk domains or anything you might think is relevant to us, please contact us straight away, and you will get a response. A real human will look at that email. And nearly all the time, if you're not spamming us, we'll get a response. You can email us at irt@csirt.ja.net. Details are on our website. Are there any questions? Go on, guys. Yeah, sorry. Are you talking about fast flux hosting? With some of the fast flux hosting, quite often we do get a reasonable response from the registrar if we wanted to attack the registrar, and we'd probably target the registrar rather than the individual IPs hosting the command and control server. Because we don't have the data of DNS names and that information in NetFlow, it's difficult to track because the command and control server would change all the time. So in those cases, we target the registrar, and we'd have a greater difficulty in finding the infected machines. Anyone else? The question was spam attacks. What proportion are from Janet outside or from Janet inside? Every single one of those spam reports, with a couple of exceptions, were from Janet outside. We don't really raise an incident when somebody else is sending us spam, because a lot of people are doing some really good work in having honeypots, which when you send a spam to it, it will straight away send a response to the CSERT team or the CERT team. So we don't see any value in that straight away. We would like to do that, but it's not a priority. We have raised a couple of incidents when people have decided to spam every university in the country. And we've also raised a couple of incidents, I think I've got one going on at the moment, when people are trying to phish UK universities. The phishing, unfortunately, is a bit of a problem. But with the phishing, we have issues, because a lot of these phishing sites we find are hosted on free network providers, where you can get web hosting straight away with a username and a password, and you just got to fill that in. You don't even have to enter your email address in some sites, and you get hosting straight away. Those are obviously problems. But because there could be legitimate users, and we've seen a couple of people on Janet connecting to those IPs on port 21 and 20, so that they obviously have their own sites there, there's still a couple of legitimate users. And that differentiates us from other commercial ISPs. Is that all right? Cool. Any others? At the back? Okay. The question was, how long specifically do we keep NetFlow data for? Was it a couple of hours, a couple of days, a couple of years? The NetFlow data on our system is actually limited into the capacity of our SAN at the moment, and we're not looking at increasing it. I won't give exact figures on it, but I can tell you it's more than a couple of days and less than a couple of weeks. Yep. The question was, the person asking the question was aware that the University of Manchester created a system for throttling and managing the bandwidth of peer-to-peer systems. We obviously we don't do that on Janet. We don't throttle connections. We like having the pipes full, because then we can get some bigger pipes. That would be a university-specific question, and I wouldn't be able to know what they're doing internally in regards to traffic shaping, because it's not directly a security incident until we start contacting them about copyright infringements. Anything else? Down there?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, if I was a vendor and I had a bunch of 100 gig NICs lying around, and I was going to build you an appliance that you would use to supplement what you're currently doing, what would that appliance do?
The question was, if the person asking the question was a vendor and they had a couple of 100 gigabit a second Ethernet links lying about to build into appliance, what would we do? we have to walk the line carefully between security and privacy. Most of the time we err on privacy, and some of the with NetFlow we can capture information such as HTTP headers, a lot more deeper information, but we don't choose to do it, even though it might have a positive effect on the security side, because we feel that would have a bad effect on our users' privacy, and we try to be very left-wing. What will we do with it? Specifically, I don't know, but we would most probably have a use for that. I just don't know specifically what we had that for. I'm sure we'd have a brainstorming session. I'll take any 100 gigabit a second Ethernet links if anyone's got any kicking around in any tents. At the front? The question was, do we do or do we plan to do any early warning systems? We do send out to UK second ounce when there is a big vulnerability, but most of the time those early warnings are in relation to a security threat such as a critical vulnerability being found in a particular operating system or a virus getting out of hand. Most of the time we don't alert to critical security patches for Windows systems because most sites should have firewalls in place and they shouldn't be directly accessible from the outside. We don't have a method of early reporting because we don't want to over-report the data. We do have, obviously, with our darknets, a way of detecting it internally, and we can feed that through the communications with other incidents to other sites. We don't have a formal system of managing those. Any other questions? I can't see anything else. So I suspect that's it. Thank you very much. Cheers.